Hi everyone, Joe Gentile from Sarraf Gentile LLP. So in our last video, we discussed all the ways that having a successful I-864 enforcement action can be life-changing in a good way for immigrants that bring these cases. And I think in the majority of situations, maybe the overwhelming majority of situations, if you have a viable claim, it's probably worth pursuing. However, as I said in the last video, there are some situations where I think it's probably smart not to go forward with the case and potentially even leave money on the table that you could otherwise collect. So here are some situations I can think of where it probably makes sense not to go forward, or to at very least give it some really strong thought before going forward. So number one, you may have a viable claim or a legally viable claim, but your sponsor or sponsors don't have the ability to pay. So there's really no point in going forward with a litigation to get a judgment against somebody that just can't pay. At the end of the day, you're just going to have a judgment, and you're not going to have anything to really show for it other than the time and effort put in to get it. So if your sponsor just is not working, makes very little money, has very little assets, it's probably not worth it to go forward with the case. Number two, there are going to be situations where your spouse or ex-spouse is being very cooperative with you, and you don't want to upset the apple cart by filing a lawsuit and changing that. So one example would be, let's say that you have what you consider to be a very favorable arrangement with child custody and child time. If things are really good there and the relationship with you and your spouse is delicate and you don't want to upset that, then maybe it makes sense not to go forward with a litigation, because if the child custody issue is the most important thing in your life and you can get by financially otherwise, then maybe you don't want to upset that. Number three, and this is a really important one, if you have legitimate concerns that your physical safety is going to be put at risk by filing a lawsuit, then you probably don't want to do it. If your spouse has a history of severe domestic violence, threats of physical violence, and you really don't have a way to protect against that, we don't want anybody to put themselves at risk physically for money. I don't think that makes sense. At the absolute worst case, you could always find a way, if you have to replace money. But you know, if there's a severe act of violence and you're injured or worse, that's something that can't be undone. So we never want to encourage people to put themselves in a situation where they're really at risk for purposes of money. So another thing is, there also may be instances where you have joint sponsors. That's common, where your spouse sponsored you, and at the time they sponsored you, they didn't have enough money to be a sole sponsor, so they brought in a friend, relative, whoever it is, to be a joint sponsor. A lot of times the joint sponsors signed on to do it because they wanted to do something nice for you, or something nice for the sponsor. And while they may be legally liable to pay you support, I could certainly see instances where somebody feels that they don't want to pursue the joint sponsor because they didn't have the relationship with the joint sponsor. They don't feel that the joint sponsor, even though legally they have an obligation to support you, you feel like morally they don't have the same obligation that your spouse does. I think that's a perfectly justifiable reason not to pursue a joint sponsor, even if you legally can. So those are just some of the reasons. that people could have a claim and decide not to pursue it. So if any of these apply to you, I certainly recommend to think it over and to give some time to figure out what you want to do. It's pretty hard to put the genie back in the bottle once you file a lawsuit with regards to some of these things. So this is something you really want to be certain about before you decide to go forward. Again, I invite you to subscribe if this is a topic that interests you. And as always, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have on I-864 enforcement or any of the issues that surround it. Thanks.